I just want to first introduce Dr. Gafni. He is our teacher today for finding the forefathers and mothers in prayer and Piyyut. In this class, the Midrash attributes the establishment of Tefillat haAmidah to the forefathers, but are they actually mentioned in those prayers themselves? And what about the foremothers? Were they represented too? We know that they do appear in Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah prayers, and even more so in later Piyutim. And by making use of the studies of famous scholars of Piyyut, we will seek to find our forebears in our prayers. And it is a big pleasure to have Dr. Gafni once again as a teacher at Yeshivas Elul. For people who are joining who are not familiar with him, he was a student at the Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and he is also an academic with degrees from Hebrew University and a PhD from Harvard. He is currently teaching at Hebrew University and Midrash at Lindenbaum, and holds several publications, including most recently the conceptions of the oral law in modern scholarship. Dr. Gafni, let me know if this is still the case. There are no particular Makoro handouts for this class. These sources are in PowerPoint. So if people are wondering where the links are, there are no links. Please watch the screen. And with that, good afternoon, Dr. Gafni.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you hear me?
All
the way from Yerushalayim. Okay, so first I want to thank Drisha Institute for having me, and also for all of you participants. It's an opportunity for us, rather than just hitting Rosh Hashanah without any earlier preparation. We get a chance to see a little bit and think a little bit about the Tefillot, about the prayers of Rosh Hashanah ahead of time. And maybe that would make our Tefillot even have more meaning as we do it. So we're going to have 2 sessions this week, and the following week, God willing, we're going to have another session. Today's session will be partially devoted to Rosh Hashanah. We'll start with other themes, and it will turn into a Rosh Hashanah theme. And next week, it will be entirely devoted to Rosh Hashanah. So I'll start with a few introductions, and then we'll actually hit the topic itself. We all know here, you know what, I'll share my screen already now, so you can see, give me a second. You see it? Okay, good. So we all know that the Tefillot, the prayers, are attributed in the Talmud and elsewhere as well to the forefathers. The Gemara, the Talmud says that Abraham was the one who established Tefillat Shacharit, the morning service. Yitzchak was the one who is associated with Mincha, and Yaakov is the one who is associated with Tefillat Arvit. At the same time, in the prayers themselves, in the text itself, they're not really mentioned explicitly. I would say with the acceptance of Abraham, who's mentioned at the end of the first blessing, Magen Avraham, but the other ones are really not there. We don't find their names, and we don't find them mentioned explicitly. However, in later texts, what I'm referring to as Piyutim, or I would say liturgical poetry, some paitanim, some of those poets made a great effort to have some reference to these, to the forefathers, to our heroes, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and even other ones. And what we're going to try to do in the course of this talk is to see how was that being done. How did they manage to include or to insert references to the forefathers in the Tefillah, both the forefathers and even perhaps the mothers are mentioned in such Piyutim. So this is the goal of our shiur. We'll start with the Shabbat prayer, and then we'll move on to the Rosh Hashanah, to the Tefillot of Rosh Hashanah, because they're going to be the part we're going to conclude with. Before we do that, though, I want to say just a few words about the idea of Piyyut. So Piyyut, the word Piyyut, is a liturgical, it's translated as liturgical poetry. The word Piyyut actually comes from the word poetry. It's the same, or they share the same root. And the Piyutim are those pieces, liturgical pieces, that were composed for the purpose of reciting on special occasions. It was not meant for daily services, but rather for special occasions, whether it was Shabbat, Yom Tov, or other special events. So those are the Piyutim. How do we classify the Piyutim? So scholars give different titles to the Piyutim based on two different criteria. One type of way of classifying the Piyutim is based on the time in the year that they were being used. In other words, Piyutim that were designated for certain days in the year got their special name. I'll give you a few examples for that. Piyutim that were meant, for instance, for Shavuot were known to be called Azharot. That was the name of the Piyutim that were meant for Shavuot. Piyutim that were meant to be said on Yom Kippur, that had to do with the Avodah of Kohen Gadol, the high priest's activities in Beit HaMikdash, so they were called Sidrei Avodah, and so on. So this is one way of defining the Piyutim. The other way of defining the Piyutim was based on the way that they were inserted into the Tefillah, the place in the Tefillah, and the fashion, the manner in which they were inserted in the text. So based on the place where the Piyyut was inserted in the Tefillah, the Piyyut was named. I'll give you again a few examples for this. Piyutim that were inserted in the blessing that is recited before Kriyat Shema, the first blessing before Kriyat Shema, Birkat Yotzer HaMeorot, so they were called Yotzrot. Piyutim that were inserted in the second bracha, Birkat Ahava Rabba Avtanu, so they were called Piyutei Ahava. There were Piyutei Zulat, Piyutei Geula, and there were also Piyutim that were inserted in Tefillat Shmoneh Esrei, in the main Tefillat haAmidah that we say. And since I mentioned that it was only done on Shabbat, so we don't have Piyutim for daily Tefillot, but only for Shabbat, and we have 7 blessings in the Shmoneh Esrei. So these Piyutim are often called Shivatot, referring to the number 7. If the Piyutim only included the first 3 blessings, they were called Kdushtot, because the Piyyut concluded with the Kedusha of the 3rd bracha. So the Piyyut was inserted in parts through the first 3 blessings, and it ended up in the bracha, in the 3rd bracha, as part of the Kedusha that was recited in the synagogue. So we have 2 types of Piyutim that are named after the time in the year where they're mentioned, and also Piyutim that are named after the place or the way that they are inserted in the Tefillah. One more, we have to say a few more words about the Piyutim before we can actually hit our particular story. Where were those Piyutim composed? Answer: most of these Piyutim are composed in Eretz Israel. The people who live here in Eretz Israel seem to have more inspiration and better talents for writing Piyutim. Don't take it personally. It's not about me. It's about people thousands of years, many hundreds of years before. But they were known to be more invested in writing Piyutim. And the people who lived outside of Eretz Israel, mainly in Bavel, in Babylon, were actually pretty much anti-Piyutim. They were much more in favor of sticking to the hardcore Tefillah and not adding any additions beyond what the basic formulation of those Tefillot. They were anti-Piyutim. It was only towards the end of I would say in the 10th century, where even Babylonian Paitanim started operating. Even people in Babylon starting writing Piyutim. One good example, and we'll turn back to him, is Rav Saadia Gaon, the famous Gaon. He also wrote some Piyutim that were supposed to have been inserted in the Tefillah. But before his time, the Piyutim were really more something that belongs to Eretz Israel. Where do we have these Piyutim nowadays? So most of this Piyyut creation, amazing creation, did not survive history. We don't have records of all the Piyutim that were ever composed. We have just fractions or a small percentage of those Piyutim. And before the discovery of the Gniza in Cairo, many of them were not even known. It was only after the Gniza was discovered that people understood the extent of this huge, massive treasure. And even at this moment, not all of these Piyutim were still were studied. There are still Piyutim that are now just being published and studied by different scholars. So this is really a massive world of literature that was only discovered relatively late, and a lot of these Piyutim were probably gone by now, and did not survive. So what we're going to do today is as follows. So that was a brief introduction. I need to say one more small thing. The ideas that I'm going to bring today are not my own ideas. This is, in a sense, a survey of some chidushim, some innovations, some discoveries of various scholars. And I think that I find them just amazing, and they made me think again about the tefillot that we say, and that's why I want to share that with you. And if you want more sources, I'll mention some of the sources as we go, but if you want more sources, I'll be happy after the class to provide maybe some more information. So how are we going to start today's class? We're going to start by introducing a prayer that we all know. We're going to start by introducing one of the Shabbat prayers, one of those prayers that we still say nowadays, not one of those forgotten Piyutim, but a Piyyut, or not one of those prayers that we lost, but rather a text that is still being recited nowadays. And we're going to bring up or discuss a bunch of a few difficulties or a few questions that this piece raises or brings forth, a few problems that appear when we read this piece of text. Then we will follow and we will see that even medieval scholars were aware of those problems, and that they also tried to explain these to solve these difficulties. However, not in a very, what I would say, a very successful way. You see that some of their answers are beautiful, maybe, but at times a little bit far-fetched. And what we will conclude by is discuss modern scholarship, some of the insights of modern scholars, and the way that they address those same problems. And I think that would give us a lot of and put new light on this prayer that we say on Shabbat, and afterwards from there we will shift to the tefillot of Yom Kippur, to one of the tefillot of Yamim Noraim of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so you got that. That's the plan. Okay, so we're starting with the prayer on here. So this is the text. Are you familiar with this? I'm sure many of you are. So this is the text that we recite every Shabbat in the morning. And this is from the Shmoneh Esrei of Shabbat. And we're talking about the fourth blessing of the Shabbat, morning haAmidah, or the morning service. So after you say the bracha of Avot, Magen Avraham, you say Baruch Ata Hashem Mechayei HaMetim, Ha'el HaKadosh, and then it starts with the following words. So I'm going to read it in Hebrew if somebody wants to volunteer and read the translation in English. Otherwise, I'll do that too. So it reads as follows. I'm starting with the fourth blessing, or the middle section of Shmoneh Esrei of Shabbat morning. It goes as follows: Yismach Moshe b'matanat chelko, ki eved ne'eman karata lo. Klil tiferet berosho natata, ve'omdo lefanecha al har Sinai, shenei luchot avanim horid biyado v'chatuv b'hem shemirat Shabbat, v'chen katuv b'toratecha. And then it goes on, v'shamru bnei Yisrael et Shabbat, etc. I'm sure you're familiar with this text. You must have read this many times before. Anybody wants to read the English? Otherwise, I'll do it. Grisha people, yeah. Moses rejoiced. This is the time for me to breathe.
And if anyone who is an attendee wants to read, just use the raise your hand icon so I can see you.
Okay.
Okay, I can read.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you want English or Hebrew?
English. I read the Hebrew. You do the English.
Moses rejoiced at the gift of his destiny when you declared him a faithful servant, adorning him with splendor as he stood in your presence atop Mount Sinai. 2 tablets of stone did he bring down, inscribed with Shabbat observance. This is written in your Torah. The people of Israel shall observe Shabbat.
Okay, so this is the passage that we always say. And what are the problems that this passage raises? So I'm going to start with more general questions and then go refer to something more particular to this piece. So what are the questions that come up when we read this? So I divided this into 3, I think, important questions, 3 very obvious questions. Okay, so what are the questions? Questions on the fourth blessing of the haAmidah. Of course, I'm referring to the haAmidah of Shabbat. So what are those questions? The first question, I think, involves, or it has to do with the fact that in most days, or whether it's a regular day or a weekday or a Yom Tov, we usually say the same haAmidah, the same Shmoneh Esrei, the same text for all 3 prayers, meaning for Shacharit, for Mincha, and for Arvit. Right? That's what we say. For instance, on Yom Tov, we say the same prayer. Ata bechartanu mikol ha'amim. We say both for Tefillat Arvit, for Tefillat Shacharit, and for Tefillat Mincha on a Yom Tov. On a weekday also, we say the same Tefillah. We have the same beginning and end, obviously, but even the middle section, it always goes on the same manner. Ata chonen le'adam dat. It's precisely the same text that is being used for all 3 prayers. in an unexpected manner, the text of the Amidah of Shabbat is not identical. Each one of the prayers of Shabbat has a different text, right? So that's the question I phrased it like this. Why is the text of the fourth blessing Amidah of Shabbat not identical in all three prayers? Or if I want to add Musaf, but let's say Musaf is already an exception, but Ma'ariv, Shacharit, meaning the night, morning, or afternoon prayer, we would expect it to be the same thing. But in a rather surprising manner, it is not the same text because we have here different texts for each one of the prayers of Shabbat. At night we say Ata Kidashta, that's the beginning of the night. For Mincha we say Ata Echad v'Shimcha Echad, and in the morning we say Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko. Why don't we have the same precise formulation for all three prayers? And maybe even for Musaf, but at least for the main three prayers that are always identical. That's question number one. Okay, makes sense. Question number two, and this is already more particular to this specific blessing. In almost all blessings, all brachot of Shmoneh Esrei, the opening word is almost always what? The word Ata. That's how we usually open the bracha. On not just the middle section, sometimes other brachot as other blessings as well, but certainly the middle part. On a regular day, we finish Ha'el HaKadosh and we say, Ata chonen adam dat. On festival, on Yom Tov, we say, Ata bechartanu mikol ha'amim. So these are the common formulations that we use. Even on Arvit, Ma'ariv, or Mincha of Shabbat, we start with the word Ata. We say Ata Kidashta, or Ata Echad v'Shimcha Echad. But there's one exception, and that is the morning service of Shabbat. We start by saying Yismach Moshe. Isn't that awkward? If we should be emphasizing, we should be addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just common sense, and we should also follow the common pattern, which is always addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu first, Ata. Why on this tefillah, why in the morning service, we start by mentioning Moshe, Yismach Moshe, rather than addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly? Why not open with saying Ata? This is also something that is very awkward when we think about this middle section. So I wrote, why does the fourth blessing start by referring to Moses, Yismach Moshe, rather than to God himself? And finally, there's also another problematic element in this bracha. We will address this briefly later on. What does the bracha say? I'm going back to the text. So the text says, here, it says, Shnei luchot avanim urid biyado. So Moses brings down the two tablets, and it says, V'chatuv b'hem shmirat Shabbat, inscribed with the Shabbat observance, and thus is what it says in your Torah. However, the verse that is quoted there is not from the tablets. V'shamru bnei Yisrael et Shabbat is a verse that is found somewhere elsewhere in Sefer Shmot. It's not part of the tablets. So why bring a quote that is not mentioned in Luchot HaBrit that were just mentioned before?
And I just want to highlight in chat, I think Jonathan Zimmett picked up a bit earlier that interesting reference.
About this he pointed out to this thing, yeah. Okay, I'm not looking at the chat all the time. It's harder for me and not for me to focus. So if I miss a chat, you can either tell me or I'll just go on and we'll wait till the end. Okay, so these are the three questions that this tefillah raises. And what I want to do now is first show you that these are not my own new questions. These questions were known to scholars throughout the years, and they were trying to address them. So first we'll demonstrate the medieval awareness to these problems and some of the attempts to solve them. And then we'll go on and proceed to what do modern scholars say about this. So we'll start with the first question. The first question we were asking, why not say the same prayer at all events, Shacharit, Mincha, and Arvit, just like we do at other times? So this is a question that we already find in the 10th century in the Sidur of Rav Saadia Gaon, one of the famous Geonim. He wrote a Sidur, but this is not a Sidur in the sense of a prayer book. It's more of a text that is devoted to the halachot, to the laws of tefillah, or some interpretations of tefillah, and the text of the tefillah is also included, but it's not really just a prayer book. And he already points out, without solving this problem, but he already says, "Umatzati et hamинהג שהברכה האמצעית של 4 תפילות השבת אינה שווה בין תפילה לחברתה." He points out, I found out, and I'm adding the unexpected phenomena that the practice is that the middle blessing of all the Shabbat prayers are not equal. So he's already sensing that there's something wrong going on here, but he doesn't explain why. Another Gaon, another one of the Geonim, was asked the following question. He's addressing the following question. He says, "Vesheshaltem, you asked me, you wondered, tefilot shel Shabbat, shel Arvit, veshel Shacharit, veshel Mincha, the prayers of Shabbat, Ma'ariv, Shacharit, and Mincha, im omran tefila achat, if one chooses to say the same precise formulation for all of them, im omran tefila achat, keshem she'anu mitpalelim biyom ha'kippurim u'veyamim tovim, if he wants to say the precise same formulation for all 3 prayers, night, morning, and the afternoon, yatzah yedei chovato or lo? Does he fulfill his obligation? And here too, I think the person who's asking this question feels there's something awkward here. Why have a different formulation for each prayer? Can I still go back and use the original way of saying it, the same text for all of 3 prayers? So here too, we see that there's an awareness to this problem, but still without an attempt to solve it. Later medievalists, and I'm going to bring just 2 examples for that, try to provide some explanation. Why is the prayer not identical? Beautiful explanations, however, not necessarily true or not necessarily accurate. So I'll give you some examples, some solutions that were offered. Why not say the same prayer for Shabbat the way we do with other prayers? So one of the scholars, medieval scholars, who's tried to solve this problem is called Abu Draham. This is a Sefer Minhagim, a book that deals with various Minhagim, and he brings the following question. Yesh shoalim, some people ask, Lama ra'u chachamim, why did the rabbis decide or establish letaken b'Shabbat shalosh tefilot meshunot zo mizo? Why did they choose to establish different prayers for the Shabbat? And he goes on and he explains, Ata kadosh v'yismach Moshe v'ata echad. Each one of the 3 prayers starts with a different formulation. Uveyom tov lo tiknu ela achat. On Yom Tov we say the same thing. Ata bechartanu. So why not have the same thing for all 3 prayers? His idea is, and again, it's a beautiful idea, but not necessarily accurate. He says perhaps this is rooted in the fact that there's a common attempt to compare Shabbat to a kala, just like we say lecha dudi likrat kala. So the kala sometimes is also alluding to Shabbat, and he says as follows: Shabbat nikret kala, ve'akadosh baruch hu nikra chatan. The answer is rooted in the fact that Shabbat is also called a bride, kala, and the Lord, Akadosh Baruch Hu, is also named, is the groom, is the chatan. So he says, he's trying to say, perhaps that is the reason why each bracha starts differently. And I'll just explain in my own words without translating to English. He assumes, perhaps in the night prayer, where we say Ata Kidashta, we're talking about the first phase of the marriage process. So first you do Kiddushin, Ata Kidashta. You move on to the morning, the Kiddushin is over, and then it's just happiness. So that's why he says, Achar kach yiseh Yismach Moshe, because it's alluding to the aspect of the simcha that is included in the marriage process. Al Shem, he says, Simchat hachatan bakala, just like the chatan is so happy with his new wife. Finally, I'm skipping a little bit. He says, on Mincha, we say, I skipped to the last part, he says, Ata echad, because that's alluding to the yichud that the chatan and the kala are doing after the chuppah. It's a beautiful idea, right? But is this really the answer? Why we say different formulations for each one? Is it really convincing that this is what the tefillah was meant, and that's why we changed the text in each one? But that's a typical medievalist attempt to solve this problem. Another attempt is brought later on. Here you see in the same book, but he's attributed to somebody else. He says Rabbi Clonimus, some Rabbi Clonimus suggested, perhaps shalosh tefilot elu hen keneget shalosh Shabbatot, Shabbat Bereshit, Shabbat shel Matan Torah, veShabbat shel Atid. So Rabbi Clonimus suggested another reason. Perhaps the 3 prayers correspond to 3 types of Shabbat. There are 3 aspects or 3 dimensions of Shabbat. Shabbat of creation, Shabbat that is related to the people of Israel, to the giving of the Torah, and the Shabbat of the future days. So each one of the prayers is alluding or is referring to a different aspect of Shabbat. And the morning service, he claims, is referring to the one that was associated with Am Yisrael and the giving of the Torah. Again, beautiful idea, but is this really the reason why the services are different? We're moving on to the second question. I still have to give you the modern scholars' approaches, but we still have to do one more step before that. So the second question we were asking, why is Moshe mentioned in this tefillah? Why don't we start with referring to God? Ata. So here too, medievalists were certainly aware of this. And look at this radical text. In Sefer HaManig, this is a book from Provence, from I think the 13th century. He says, Rabbeinu Shlomo lo haya omer yismach Moshe. Who do you suppose this Rabbeinu Shlomo is? It's not just a regular, an ordinary Shlomo. It's a very special Shlomo. This is referring to Rashi. Rabbeinu Shlomo here is Rashi, and he's coming up with this amazing testimony that Rashi would not say Yismach Moshe. V'haya omer ata bechartanu. Rashi would refrain from saying Yismach Moshe on Shabbat, and he actually chose to say ata bechartanu also during Shabbat. Ki lo haya yodea, because Rashi didn't know ma inyan Shabbat Yismach Moshe. What does Moshe have to do with Shabbat? If you want to talk about an ordinary tefillah, start with ata bechartanu. Why refer to something that is why bring Moshe into the picture, and certainly at the beginning of the blessing? In attempt to solve this problem, so medievalists again came up with very beautiful ideas. Why is Moshe really relevant for Shabbat? Very nice answers, but not necessarily giving us the real reason why Moshe was inserted in the tefillah. So I'll show you some ideas that medievalists came up with. So they're all based on text in the Talmud. All different types of attempts. Why is Moshe related to the Shabbat? So some scholars some medievalists were referring to a text in Shabbat, Yud Amud Bet, in Masechet Shabbat 10b, where the text says, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, Matana tova yesh li bebet gnazai v'Shabbat shma, v'ani mevakesh litna laYisrael, lech hodi'am. So God tells Moses, I have a precious gift in my treasure house called the Shabbat, and desire to give it to Israel. Go and inform them. So some scholars suggested, perhaps because Moshe was the one who delivers this present of Shabbat to the people of Israel, that's why we start with him, Yismach Moshe. You see in source number 3 here, it refers to Rabbeinu Yaakov. That's the grandson of Rashi. And what we see here, what he says here, Rabbeinu Yaakov menuchato kavod, so that's Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi. Hechzir hadavar liyoshno. He decided to go back to reciting the text of Yismach Moshe. And why is that? Because he said there's a good reason for saying Yismach Moshe, and he alludes, or he brings the text in Masechet Shabbat. Moshe was the one who was the person who delivered Shabbat to the people of Israel. That's one text, one attempt to explain why was Moshe mentioned here. Another attempt, here you'll see another attempt in the following text. In Shabbat, again, but this time 86b, the Talmud says that according to all sorts of, according to different sages, the Kuli Alma, they all agree, Shabbat nitna Torah l'Israel. Shabbat was the day in which the Torah was given to Israel. And they bring a source for this from some verse. Again, all agree that the Torah was given to Israel on the Shabbat. Some scholars concluded maybe that's why Moshe is mentioned here. In a book called Sefer Or Zarua by a guy from Vienna, one of the medievalists from Wien. So he said as follows: Lachen matchil tefillat Shabbat b'Yismach Moshe. That's why we start by the Shabbat service with Yismach Moshe and not with Ata bechartanu, not with the words Ata bechartanu that we start in other days. Why is that? So the answer is Mishum de'amrinan b'Shabbat nitna Torah l'Yisrael. That is because we say that the Torah was given to Israel on Shabbat, and that was done through Moshe again. So either because Moshe gave the Shabbat, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Shabbat to Moshe in general, or in addition, because Shabbat was given to Moshe, the Torah was given to Moshe on Shabbat. So that's why we refer to the Matan Torah and we mention Moshe here. One last answer. We have to get to modern scholars, to the main part of this thing. Another attempt. Some people even came up with the brilliant idea, we're relying on the brilliant idea, that Moshe was the one who actually initiated the day of Shabbat. How come? So here too, we have a beautiful Midrash. The Midrash says in Shmot Rabbah, in Exodus Rabbah, as follows. Moshe sees that his fellow brothers are suffering. They have no day of break. I'm reading it immediately in English. Moses observed that the Israelites have no rest. So he went, said to Pharaoh, one who has a servant must understand that if the servant has no rest one day a week, he will die. And likewise, with regard to the Israelites, your servants, if you do not allow them one day free of work, they will die. Pharaoh said to Moses, go and arrange for them as you said. So Moses went and established for them the Shabbat day for them to rest. This is the Midrash. And here too, we have a very nice link between Moshe and the Shabbat. Again, some scholars say that's why we make a big deal with Moshe on Shabbat. Again, Abu Draham says, I'll read the English. Another reason, according to that, to what the Midrash says, and he quotes the entire Midrash, he ends by saying, and when they left Egypt, Shabbat was given to them. And when Moses saw that he was thinking in the same spirit as his creator, he was very pleased. And that is why it was established to say, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko. Moses was so happy because he saw that God actually approved of his idea. I'm summarizing what we've seen so far. So far we addressed a bunch of questions that have to do with the prayer of Yismach Moshe. The fact that it's not the same formulation for all three prayers, the fact that it starts by referring to Moshe and not to Kadosh Baruch Hu. And I also mentioned another problem without bringing medievalists. Why is the text starting with Luchot HaBrit, but then quoting a verse that is not found on the 10 tablets, in the 10 commandments? Those were the questions we raised. And I was trying to demonstrate that medievalists were aware of these problems and that they came up with very interesting ideas. Now we're going to get to the modern discoveries of modern scholars. And I think that it's a beautiful example. It demonstrates beautifully how modern scholars were able to contribute with amazing insights due to the means and text that they had that perhaps scholars beforehand were not had no access to. So we're going to talk about a scheme of events, a few scholars that each one contributing his own part to this big picture. So how did it work? How did it go? So the first modern scholars that I want to refer to is this guy whose name was Menachem Zulai. You see his name on the book here. He was a very important Piyyut scholar. He was one of the biggest scholars that were invested in Piyyut. He was operating in a place called Hamachon Lecheker Hashira Ivrit Yerushalayim, the institution where Hebrew poetry was studied in Yerushalayim. It's in a place today called Shoken Institute, across the street from the prime minister's home. That's where the place was. And he was the first scholar who noticed something interesting about this prayer. And what he mainly noticed is just one interesting textual variant that he found in the Gniza. If you recall, the text we have today is Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, ki eved ne'eman karata lo, klil tiferet b'roshon atata b'omdo lefanecha al har Sinai, shenei luchot avanim urid biyado, and so on. You remember? So look what he found. So his discovery was just one word that was missing in a bunch of Gniza fragments, text from the Gniza in Cairo. So look what he found. In the Gniza text here, it says, the beginning sounds the same. Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, ki eved ne'eman karata lo, klil tiferet b'rosho natata be'amidato lefanecha al har Sinai, slightly different. And then one word is missing here. Luchot avanim horid biyado v'chatuv b'hem shmirat Shabbat, or shimru Shabbat. You see one word is missing, something that we often say. Which word is missing? We usually say, before the luchot, we say, shenei luchot avanim horid biyado v'chatuv b'hem shmirat Shabbat. That was the standard version that people often said. But he pointed out that in this Gniza fragment, we don't have the word shnei. It starts with the word luchot avanim horid biyado. This is true in this Gniza fragment, but also in other texts from the Gniza. You see, this is from the University of Cambridge Library. You see the words Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, ki eved ne'eman karata lo, kli tiferet b'roshon atata b'omdo lefanecha al har Sinai. And again, We don't have the word shenei luchot avanim morid biyado, but rather luchot avanim morid biyado. It's not in all Gniza fragments. In some Gniza fragments, we still have the word shenei. You see here, you do have the word shenei luchot avanim morid biyado. But in many of the Gniza fragments, we don't have the word shenei. Why is that so significant? Because once we understand that the text was slightly different, it leaves room for a very interesting assumption. At this point, it was still an assumption that perhaps this is just one piece of a great piyut, of a larger piece of piyut that actually followed the entire alphabet. And it's basically an acrostic with the entire alphabet. And here we just have one piece out of many pieces. If you notice, the lines that we have here create, without the word shenei, you already have here yud, kaf, lamed. You see that? So why not speculate? Perhaps this is a piece of a larger piyut. Zulay did not address that much, but the following scholar, whose name was Aharon Mirsky, another important Piyut scholar, you see this is his book, and that's what he looked like. So he came up and he speculated, in a sense, what could have been the structure of this entire Piyut. Now you have to remember, we have 7 blessings, and we see here that the middle blessing is Yud Kaf Lamed. It's very natural to assume then that each one of the blessings was corresponding to 3 letters of the alphabet, creating the entire alphabet from the beginning to the end. Like this, you see? So we have, for each one of the blessings, we have, for Avraham, again Avraham, it probably went something with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Baruch Ata Hashem, again Avraham. Perhaps the second part was Daled, Hey, Vav, and then we had Mechaya Metim, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Ha'el HaKadosh, and what we have nowadays is just one piece that survived from that entire big piyut that went, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chilko, kli leferet rosho natata, luchot avanim morid biyado. That was the Yud Kaf Lamed of that entire large piyut. And then it went on. 5, 6, 7, the last brachot were probably Mem, Nun, Samech, Pe, Ayin, Pe, Tzadik, Kuf, Resh, Shin, and since we have 22 letters and only 7 brachot, so the last piece probably had 4 letters of the alphabet. That was his speculation or his assumption. Perhaps this is part of a larger piyut. That on its own, I think, is an amazing insight or speculation. But at this point, maybe it was still a little bit a speculation. However, later scholars added another step or another piece to this puzzle, and they were even able to demonstrate what such a piyut would look like. What do I mean? So the following scholar that is very important in this story is this guy. His name is Yosef Yahalom. He lives about a half a kilometer from where I'm sitting right now in Yerushalayim. And he wrote a bunch of books on Piyut. This is not the main book that I'm referring to where he put this idea, but this is one of his later compositions. He's a scholar that is mainly invested in Piyutim, Shira in general, poetry in general, but mainly liturgical poetry. He added another element in this thesis, and his idea was that perhaps it's not just an alphabetic piyut that covered the entire prayer of Shmoneh Esrei, but rather that each one of the blessings was probably associated or designated to a different one of our forefathers, that perhaps each blessing was meant to focus on one figure. Now, I think it's very easy to guess what each blessing was, was dealing, which figure was the hero of each one of those blessings. So we can just imagine that Magen Avraham was probably devoted to who? To Avraham, right? Magen Avraham. Mechaya Metim naturally will be related to Yitzchak. Ha'el HaKadosh, in a natural way, will continue, and that will be associated with Yaakov. The next one is what we still have, and that would be Yismach Moshe. So the fourth one will be associated with Moshe. Any guesses? So who would be associated, or who would be connected to the bracha of Avodah, of the return to Beit HaMikdash, God's return to Beit HaMikdash and the renewal of the worship in Beit HaMikdash. That is naturally who? Aharon, right. We move on. The sixth bracha was probably associated, and here you have to just trust me that it would be connected to David. And finally, Sim Shalom, Shalom, kind of nice play of words with Shlomo. So perhaps that was about Shlomo. Yosef Yahalom's speculation is that the entire Piyyut, again, following the alphabet, each blessing connected to a different figure, went like that. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, and Shlomo. And we have just one piece of that entire Piyyut. It still sounds a little bit speculation, but he was able to provide a beautiful example of an existing Piyyut that follows the precise pattern that I'm talking about. And that is a Piyyut that was written by Rav Saadia Gaon himself, not a marginal figure, a big, important figure in Jewish history. And look at this amazing Piyyut that he found here. I'm skipping a piece from his book, from Yahalom's book, and this is a Piyyut that was composed by Rav Saadia Gaon himself. It's a Shiv'ata, as I mentioned before, a Piyyut that is supposed to be inserted in the entire text of a Tefillah of Shabbat. We have 7 blessings and 7 insertions of pieces into the blessing, into the different blessings. You see the first 2 lines are connected to Magen Avraham, the second one to Mechaya Metim, then you have to Ha'el HaKadosh, and so on. Now look how it goes. Try to forget about the first word for a second, okay? What do you see here? So each line, each 2 lines here that are connected to one of the blessings, you see that they follow the alphabet. You see Aleph, Ahuv, Bet, Behashket, Gimel is Gibor, and then you conclude, Baruch Atah Hashem, Magen Avraham. You go on. Daled is for Daled is Dlatot, Daltot, Halo, Umalach, Baruch Atah Hashem Mechaya Metim. Then you have Zayin, Zrach, Chet, Chashor, Tet, Taher, Ha'el HaKadosh. And then you hit the middle bracha. Yishachem, Yud, Kanat, Nit'o, Kaf, La'ad, Techonenu. And then you have the end of the bracha. Precisely the pattern that these scholars were just speculating that could have been the original formulation of the bracha. But what's more amazing is that it also follows the associations with the forefathers and the prayer. Each blessing is alluding in the Piyyut to one of the forefathers. I'm sorry. You see in the first text here, you see an end of the bracha in the Piyyut. Tegoneneni, you shall defend us, betzedek, with the merit of Av ba me'ever hanahar. Who is the father that came from Ever hanahar? This is Avraham. Baruch Atah Hashem, again Avraham. You go on. Second line. I'm not translating anything because that will take us forever, and I don't know how to translate all these words. The second line, you should lehachayotenu, you should make us alive again. I don't know. Betzedek, with the right of Bamibo. Who was Bamibo? This is Yitzchak. In the Torah, it says V'Yitzchak Bamibo be'er lachai roi. So it's alluding to Yitzchak. You go on. The third bracha. Tukdash banu, you shall be sanctified through us. Kenam talo, just like you told him. Hine anochi imach. That's from the dream of Yaakov with the ladder. Hine anochi imach u'shmarticha b'chol asher telech. So each one of those sections is associated with one of the forefathers, using the alphabet order, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, precisely what these scholars were speculating would have been the form of our current Piyyut. So what we conclude at this point, and that's before we move into Rosh Hashanah, is that Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, ki eved neman karata lo, kli tiferet b'roshon atata b'omdo lefanecha al har Sinai, luchot avanim morid biyado, is just one piece of an entire Piyyut, one piece that survived. And if this is the case, I think we don't need to try to find some, particular connection between Moshe and this and Shmoneh Esrei, because it was part of a larger picture, and the entire Piyyut had to do with all of the forefathers, not just Moshe. And we also shouldn't be wondering, why is it not that we follow the same pattern of Shmoneh Esrei? Because this is not Chazal that changed the formulation. It's just a Piyyut that was inserted into our Tefillah. And for some reason or another, these 3 lines survived history. against all odds, and they were still kept in our Sidurim. What did the original Shmoneh sound like? Maybe it started by saying, Ata bechartanu mikol ha'amim, and maybe it even said, V'chen katuv v'toratecha, v'shamru bnei Yisrael et haShabbat. It was only when these lines were inserted in, we created this, something that is a bit awkward, that we start with Luchot HaBrit, that was part of the Piyyut, and it shifted to the ordinary text, which meant with V'shamru bnei Yisrael et haShabbat. So I think it gives us a much better sense. When I heard this, I was amazed for the first time, and I really felt that it put different light on the entire Tefillah of Shabbat for me, that I understood it's not just a few lines that come out of nowhere. It's part of a larger picture, and this is just a taste of what the entire Piyyut could have sounded like. But I promised we're going to say something about Rosh Hashanah as well. What about Rosh Hashanah? So I'll start with another question. What about the mothers? Don't they get to have to be referred somewhere? We have here tefillot, and they're all males, right? They're all male oriented. It's only the forefathers. What about the nashim? What about the imahot? Are they not mentioned in those tefillot? In a fascinating way, they are, but not on a Shabbat prayer, but only on Yamim Noraim. And I'm referring to the tefillot of Rosh Hashanah, of the high holidays on Rosh Hashanah. This is a piyut that we actually still recite, not something that that stayed in the Gnizail somewhere, but this is a text that we still recite in its entire form, not like the Yismach Moshe that we have just a bit or a glimpse of that original piyut. Here we have the entire piyut that survived. But we have to start with one thing before we get there. If you recall, the Gemara and the Midrashim all say, we'll have share this tradition that on Rosh Hashanah, on New Year's, that was the day that the mothers were finally conceived. After a long time, there have been akarot, parents. The Gemara says in Yevamot, Amar Mar, the master said, Berosh Hashanah nifkedu Sarah, Rachel, v'Chana. So here they refer to three mothers that were conceived that day. Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were remembered. Nifkedu, we can say also remembered on New Year's Day. Right? That's one tradition. Other traditions also add in Rivka. In the Midrash of Tanchuma, we have Rivka added as well. Arba akarot nifkedu beRosh Hashanah. There were four mothers that were conceived on Rosh Hashanah, for barren women that were visited on Rosh Hashanah. Ve'eluhen, and those are the four: Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Hannah. As a matter of fact, when we do the lanings, the text that we read on the Torah b'Shabbat, we also allude to all of them. We refer to Sarah in the first day by we say V'Adonai pakad et Sarah kasher dam'ar v'yas leSarah kasher diber. So we refer to Sarah. Rachel and Hannah are mentioned in the Haftarot. In the first one day we say Rachel mevaka al banea, and the other one we talk about the story of Hannah. It's not a matter of coincidence. It's an attempt to mention them on Rosh Hashanah because they have something to do with this day. The Paitanim, the people who wrote those Piyutim, followed the same path, and they wanted to find a way to include those mothers, and especially on Rosh Hashanah, that is a day that was associated with them anyway. However, there were only the number of imahot is much smaller, and it made more sense not to do it in the form of Shiv'ata, a text that will refer or correspond to 7 blessings, but rather as a Kedushta. Kedushta, if you remember, it's the Piyutim that only correspond to the first 3 brachot. And this is indeed what they have done. I hope you're enjoying the beautiful art along the way. It's more impressive than the words sometimes. So this is how, you see here, this is supposed to be Yitzchak and Rivka praying for a baby, and it says, Vaye'ater lo Hashem, God answers the tefillah. So this is, you see here, if we can say a picture of somebody from heaven accepting the prayers here. So this is one example. This is the art on the side. But look here. Now we're turning into a Kedushta. Kedushta, again, is a Piyyut, a prayer that is referring to the first 3 parts of the tefillah, of first 3 blessings: Avot, Gvurot, and Kedusha. With also the Piyyut was also went into the part that we say when we say Chazarat Hashatz, also into the part of the Kedusha that we say with the Chazan, not just the blessings, but also into the Tefillat, the Kedusha itself. This is the picture from the very important Machzor, the worms Machzor. And you see here in red letters, the scribe is pointing out that here we're about to start a Kedushta, meaning a Piyyut. It's not part of the original text of Shmoneh Esrei, the hardcore part of Shmoneh Esrei, but rather a later insertion that is supposed to be added in. We still say this text in many communities as part of the Shmoneh Esrei, not the entire Piyyut, but big chunks of it. And how does the Piyyut start? It doesn't follow precisely the same pattern that I said before. And one difference I will address in a second. So look how it goes. It's very long, and the translation is a mess. I checked a bunch of sidurim, and I had a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, that helped me a lot, trying to find an accurate translation. So I didn't try even to translate more than the crucial sentences for our purposes. But this is the first. So this is the part that refers to the first blessing, to the avot. So in addition to the blessing itself, to the text of the Shmoneh Esrei itself, the Piyyut will go, and here you see each one of the blessings. It's a long Piyyut. So each section follows the alphabet, the entire alphabet within each bracha. Not like the way we did before, that it's only Aleph, Bet, Gimel. Here, in each bracha, you have the entire set of alphabet. At, Be'imav, Gashim, you see it starts with the alphabet, and here I skipped a big part. And at the end, it goes back, it concludes. This is how the first blessing ends. She'unim alea ba leipakda, sho'agim belak delatot leshokda, temuchim bedeshen se'akeda, tesher asher bo nifkada. So I'm going to save you the efforts of trying to translate this. This is a mess. And again, even people who know Hebrew well and people who have great English abilities to translate things are struggling exactly what would be the precise translation. So I just used the translation for the last passage with the help of a friend. And the last line that reads in Hebrew, Tmuchim bedeshen se'akeda, tesher asher bo nifkada. Perhaps we can translate. They are confident in the ashes of Isaac, who was bound like a sheep in Tishrei, Tesher, on the day, she, meaning Sarah, bo nifkada. You see the root pakad appears twice, lehipakeda and nifkada. This is alluding to the verse in Bereshit, Vashem pakad et Sarah. So the first blessing in the Piyyut was associated with Sarah, the one that was nifkada. Do you want to guess who would be the next one? I think you can already guess by now. The second blessing will be associated with whom? You don't have too many options, Rivka. So let's see how it goes. This is Gvurot, the second blessing. And here, since the first blessing went from Aleph to Taf, Aleph Bet Gimel, and ended up with Taf, so the second blessing starts from the end and goes to the beginning. Taf, Shin, Reish, and so on. You see, Ta'alat, Zu kechafetz le'atil, Sho'a aroch limdam le'o'il, Ron, because it went all the way from Aleph to Taf in the first blessing, so now we're going in a reversed order. And at the end, the text reads, Elai lehe'ater, kmo ne'etara, or like the cries, I should start before, Enkat asir az ki uchtara, Elai lehe'ater kmo ne'etara, meaning like the cries of the captive, which then became your crown. Hear my pleas, like her who were once heard. That's the possible translation. But here the root is not lehipaked, but lehe'ater. And this is again an allusion to the story of Rivka. In the Torah it says, Vaye'etar Yitzchak la'Hashem lenochach ishto ki akarai, Vaye'ater lo Hashem v'tar Rivka ishto. So the second blessing goes, or is supposed to allude to the story of Rivka. This is supposed to be Rivka with the Gmalim, with the camels. You remember with the Eliezer, the slave, that whole story. Finally, the third one will be Rachel. Now, we started with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. We reached Taf in the first blessing, but then went down, reversed from Taf to Aleph in the second one. So now we're going back up. Even, Chug, that's the beginning. Even, Chug, blah, blah, blah. Befinat, Rosh, Yesod, Shlishiya, Givat, Shoresh, Musad, Panim. So you see it follows the order of the alphabet, now from beginning to end. And at the very end, Levadeha, Ta'amod, Beyom Zechira, lehizacher kemo nizkera. So we had lehipaked with regards to Sarah, leheater with regards to Rivka, and lehizacher is the third one. Levadea ta'amod biyom zchira, lehizacher lama kemo nizkara. Her merits endures for the offsprings of this day, of this day of remembrance, that they be remembered as she once was. And here it's Rachel in the Torah, vayizkor Elohim et Rachel. So it's not a coincidence that he chose to stick to the root of Zayin Chaf Resh, Zachar, because this is about Rachel. This is amazing, I think. It shows us how brilliant these Paitanim were, both in terms of the structure and in terms of the content. They managed to tie into the Shmoneh Esrei, the forefathers or the foremothers in this particular case, and especially with regards to Rosh Hashanah, they had three mothers that were conceived. What would be more natural on Rosh Hashanah? What would be more natural to decide to insert them into the Piyyut? This is a Piyyut that was composed by a Paitan, a very famous Paitan named Rabbi Elazar HaKalir. He was hardly known before the discovery of the Gniza Cairo. His name was known, but not much more was known about him. Once the Gniza was discovered, a lot of his Piyutim became more famous. However, this Piyyut, this piece, was known even during the medieval period. It's not something that entered our Sidurim at a later stage, and that's why you see all of these medieval texts, medieval manuscripts that record the Piyyut. The Paitanim here put in red the words that might be more relevant for the reader, and here you see that they included the root of the Zachar, so the person who's using the Machzor will notice that this is alluding to the story of Rachel. One last thing I should mention, and then I'm done. I just want to refer to one interesting side point. In this Piyyut, you see that it doesn't follow Aleph, Bet, Gimel for each blessing, but the entire alphabet for each one. It goes up, down, up, down. This is probably also what our Musaf prayer on Shabbat was like. How does the middle part of Musaf start today? It goes, Tikanta, Shabbat, Ratzita, Korbonotea, Tzivita, Perusha, Im Sidurei Nesacha. It goes from Taf to the beginning. Why? Because probably, again, it was part of a larger Piyyut. The first blessing was Aleph through Taf. The second blessing was Taf through Aleph. The third one was Aleph through Taf. And the fourth one was Taf to Aleph again. So again, we have just a remaining piece of this beautiful entire Piyyut that was just lost throughout the generations. Okay, so this is the end of today's class. I hope that it would give you some room for thought during Rosh Hashanah. And I want to thank Drisha again for allowing me to present this. And if somebody wants more sources, you can probably look at the presentation. You can see more elaborated discussions about this in the books that I mentioned and in other books as well. Yes, I see one. I can answer one question. I'm not sure I can answer all questions. We can try one. Yeah.
Emily.
Oh, thank you. Well, what I'm getting out of this, which is very striking, and I know I'll think about it on Rosh Hashanah, is the attempt to link our present with, because that's what Rosh Hashanah, essentially, we think, I know there's Malchut, et cetera, but by and large, Yamim Noraim, I think I'll speak for myself, we focus on ourselves. And here we create a sense of continuity, which I think is always a matara in Jewish thought and Jewish prayer. So thank you very much. And
what you're saying is amazing. And I think that this is the essence of Tefillah, that we feel we're part of one big history. We don't just read this and think about us. This is the day that a lot of things happened, and we're just one more stage in that long story, one more piece in that big picture.
The link in the chain, as I used to say to my children.
Okay.
Toda
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Next week, we'll talk about Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, and how they made their way from the Talmud to our prayer book. Thank you very much, Noah. Bye-bye.
And we have a very full day of learning this afternoon. If you would like to, if you have the time and the interest, feel free to join us in about a half hour at 1 p.m. Eastern with Professor Daniel Matt's class on Elijah, or with Dr. Dror Bondi's class on Heschel at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to join us for any of our Elul classes, you can do so at drisha.org, at elul.drisha.org. And if you want to join come back next week, same time with Dr. Gafni's class, please make sure to sign up on our website if you have not already done so.